The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in fading hues of orange and purple. The distant rumble of a train echoed through the quiet countryside, growing louder with every passing second. On the cold steel tracks, a golden retriever sat motionless, her body shielding two tiny puppies pressed close to her chest. Her eyes glimmered with fear and fierce determination. The train's headlights pierced through the darkness, bearing down on them. But she didn't move. She wasn't running. She was protecting. For days, the stray mother and her puppies had wandered along empty roads, their fragile bodies worn down by hunger and exhaustion. Earlier that evening, the smell of food had drawn her to the tracks, where she found a forgotten piece of bread. But just as she began to guide her pups away, the ominous sound of the approaching train filled the air. She was trapped. Dense bushes and jagged rocks lined both sides of the tracks, making escape impossible. Time was running out. A short distance away, Jack, a retired railroad worker in his early 60s, was out on his usual evening walk. Widowed and living alone, Jack found solace in the rhythmic hum of the trains he once worked on. The familiar sound brought him back to simpler times. But that night, something was different. A faint, distressed bark broke through the air. He stopped, his brows furrowing as he strained to hear it again. Instinctively, he turned on his flashlight and picked up his pace, heading toward the sound. When Jack finally spotted the dog on the tracks, his heart stopped. The train was closing in fast, its horn blaring. Desperation took over as Jack shouted, "Get off the tracks!" His voice echoed into the night, but the dog didn't budge. Instead, she locked eyes with him, a silent plea, but also a firm resolve. She wasn't going anywhere without her puppies. Jack didn't hesitate. He dropped his flashlight and sprinted toward them, the ground shaking beneath him as the train bore down. In those final, heart-pounding moments, Jack reached the tracks just in time to scoop the two puppies to safety. But the mother dog was still there, her golden fur illuminated by the train's headlights. Jack lunged toward her, his arms outstretched, but the roaring train was too close. The world erupted in noise and blinding light as the train rushed past. When the dust finally settled, Jack opened his eyes, trembling, and searched frantically for the dog and her puppies. What he saw next left him utterly speechless. The air was thick with the lingering roar of the passing train. Jack coughed as the dust began to settle, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. He scrambled to his feet, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he swept the beam across the tracks. For a moment, all he could see were scattered bits of gravel and the gleaming steel rails. Panic gripped him. "Where are they?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. Then, just off the side of the tracks, he caught sight of movement. The golden retriever was there, lying on her side, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Beside her, the two puppies whimpered, their tiny bodies trembling but unharmed. Jack felt a wave of relief so intense that his knees nearly buckled. He rushed to the dog's side, carefully kneeling down. "You're alive," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" The mother dog opened her eyes and looked at Jack, her gaze filled with both exhaustion and gratitude. Her body was battered. There was a deep gash on her hind leg, likely from the train's debris, but she was alive. Jack gently ran his hand over her fur, his voice soothing as he said, "You're okay now. I've got you." He glanced at the puppies, who were now huddling close to their mother. They were so small, their eyes barely open, and they didn't yet understand how close they had come to tragedy. Jack knew he couldn't leave them there. The night was growing colder, and the mother dog needed immediate care. Without another thought, he took off his flannel jacket and carefully wrapped it around the mother dog. He then picked up the puppies, tucking them securely into the folds of the jacket. The mother let out a soft whimper, but she didn't resist. It was as if she knew Jack was there to help. "Hang in there, girl," he murmured. "We're going to get you somewhere safe." Carrying the fragile bundle in his arms, Jack began the slow walk back toward his truck, parked near the edge of the tracks. The puppies nestled against their mother, who remained silent but alert, her eyes occasionally meeting Jack's. Despite the pain she was clearly in, there was something resolute about her gaze, as though she trusted him completely. As Jack reached the truck and gently placed them inside, a thought struck him. What kind of life had they endured to end up here, and why had no one come for them? Jack drove carefully along the winding road back to his small farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The soft glow of the dashboard lights illuminated the exhausted mother dog lying on the passenger seat, her head resting on his bundled jacket. The two puppies were nestled close to her, their tiny breaths creating a rhythmic rise and fall. Every now and then, Jack glanced at them, his mind racing. He hadn't planned for this. He lived alone, and the last pet he'd owned had been a barn cat nearly a decade ago. But as he looked at the injured dog, he knew he couldn't turn away. By the time Jack pulled into his driveway, the moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale glow over his modest home. He stepped out and carefully lifted the mother dog and her pups from the truck, cradling them in his arms. "Easy now," he murmured. The dog whimpered softly but didn't resist. She seemed to understand that he was trying to help. Jack carried them inside, placing them gently on an old blanket he'd spread out near the wood stove. The warmth of the fire filled the room, and the puppies quickly settled into the cozy spot. Jack examined the mother's injuries under the soft light of a lamp. The gash on her hind leg was deep, but not life-threatening. He grabbed a clean towel, some warm water, and the first aid kit he always kept in the house. "This is going to sting a little," he warned softly, dabbing at the wound. The dog flinched but didn't growl or snap, her trust in him unwavering. As he worked, Jack couldn't help but wonder what kind of life she had lived before ending up on the tracks. She was clearly someone's dog once. Her coat, though matted, still had a faint shine, and her gentle demeanor suggested she'd known kindness before. After cleaning and bandaging the wound, Jack leaned back inside, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The mother dog looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, and gave his hand a small lick. It was such a simple gesture, but it struck Jack deeply. "You're a brave one," he said quietly, his voice almost breaking. He thought about how she had stayed on the tracks, refusing to abandon her puppies even in the face of certain death. There was a kind of love in her actions that Jack hadn't seen in years, not since his wife had passed away. As the fire crackled softly, Jack sat back on an old armchair, watching the little family begin to relax. The puppies nuzzled into their mother's side, their tiny tails wagging slightly as they drifted off to sleep. For the first time in a long while, the house felt alive again. But as Jack's eyes began to close, a thought crept into his mind that wouldn't let him rest. Who could have abandoned a dog like this? And why? He knew there were answers out there, and he had a feeling this story was far from over. The morning sunlight spilled through the windows, warming the cozy living room where the mother dog and her puppies were resting. Jack rubbed his eyes and stretched as he got up from the armchair, his back aching from sleeping in a position he hadn't intended. His gaze fell on the little family, who were still curled up on the blanket by the wood stove. The mother dog's eyes opened briefly, watching Jack as if to ensure he was still there, before closing them again in exhaustion. The sight made Jack smile, but his mind was already working. He needed to figure out what had happened to them. After making a pot of coffee, Jack walked to his old rotary phone and hesitated. He could call the local animal shelter for help, but something held him back. The thought of the dog and her puppies being placed in a cold, crowded kennel didn't sit right with him. Instead, he grabbed his keys and an old notebook where he kept notes about the people in town. Jack knew almost everyone in the small community, and if anyone recognized the dog, he might get some answers. His first stop was the diner just a few miles away. It was a gathering place for locals, and if there was any gossip about a missing dog, it would be there. As Jack walked in, the familiar jingle of the doorbell drew the attention of Maggie, the diner's owner. "Morning, Jack," she said warmly, pouring him a cup of coffee before he even sat down. "You're out and about early. What's on your mind?" Jack pulled out a photo he'd taken of the dog and her puppies with an old Polaroid camera he kept at home. "You seen this dog around before?" he asked, sliding the photo across the counter. Maggie studied the picture, her brow furrowing. "She does look familiar," she said slowly. "I think I've seen her near the old Miller farm a few times. No one's lived there in years, though. The place is falling apart." Jack nodded, making a mental note to check the area later. As he thanked Maggie and turned to leave, an older man at the corner booth spoke up. "That dog," the man said, his voice gruff. "She belonged to some folks who moved away months ago. Left everything behind, including her. She's been wandering ever since." Jack's stomach tightened at the man's words. He couldn't fathom how someone could abandon such a loyal creature. Driving back home, he couldn't shake the image of the dog waiting by the tracks, her puppies depending on her for everything. It was clear that she had been through more than he initially thought. But now, Jack felt a growing sense of responsibility. Not just to care for her and her pups, but to piece together her story, and maybe, just maybe, find her a better ending than the one she was left with. Jack couldn't shake the old man's words as he drove toward the Miller farm. The thought of someone abandoning the golden retriever and her puppies gnawed at him. Her quiet strength, her willingness to protect her pups at all costs. It didn't seem possible that anyone could leave such a loyal creature behind. As his truck rattled down the dirt road toward the long-abandoned property, a knot formed in his stomach. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he hoped to find answers. The Miller farm emerged through the bare trees, a haunting reminder of better days. The barn, its roof partially collapsed, leaned precariously to one side, while the old farmhouse was a shell of its former self, windows broken and its front porch sagging under the weight of time. Jack pulled his truck into the overgrown driveway and stepped out, boots crunching on the gravel. He immediately noticed signs that animals had been here. Paw prints scattered in the dirt, tufts of fur clinging to a rotting fence post. The dog had clearly stayed here recently, perhaps as a last refuge before the tracks. Jack pushed open the warped front door of the house, which creaked loudly in the quiet morning air. Inside, the stale smell of neglect hung heavy, mixed with faint traces of animal musk. His flashlight illuminated the remnants of a forgotten life. A dusty rocking chair, yellowed curtains hanging limply in the broken windows, and old newspapers scattered across the floor. In the far corner of one room, Jack found a small pile of torn blankets, clearly used as a makeshift bed. His chest tightened. This must have been where the mother dog had sheltered her puppies. A place to rest when the world outside offered no comfort. As Jack stood in the doorway, lost in thought, a low growl broke the silence. He froze, turning toward the sound. Came from the barn. Heart pounding, he moved cautiously toward it, stepping over the fallen beams. Inside the shadowy barn, a thin, scarred stray dog glared at him from the darkness, its teeth bared in warning. Jack crouched slightly, keeping his voice soft. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you," he said gently. The stray didn't approach, but it didn't flee either. Jack backed away slowly, realizing that the farm wasn't just a place of survival for the golden retriever. It was a sanctuary for abandoned souls like her. On the drive back home, Jack glanced at the golden retriever resting in his passenger seat. Her puppies were curled up beside her, oblivious to the world's hardships. The visit to the Miller farm had given him a glimpse into her resilience, but there were still unanswered questions. Why had she left that place of refuge? What had driven her to the train tracks that night? Jack couldn't shake the feeling that her story wasn't finished, and he was determined to see it through, not just for her, but for the connection he felt growing stronger with every moment. What do you think happened to the mother dog before Jack found her? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your theories. The golden retriever lay quietly by the wood stove, her puppies nestled against her side. Jack sat at his kitchen table, staring at the map spread out before him. His mind replayed everything he'd seen at the Miller farm. The abandoned house, the makeshift bed, and the stray dog guarding the barn. None of it answered his questions about the golden retriever, but a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. There had to be more to her story, something he hadn't uncovered yet. Jack's eyes landed on a small red X marked on the map, just a few miles from the Miller farm. The symbol identified the location of a dog breeding kennel that had been shut down years ago. He remembered hearing about it in the local news. The place had been exposed for operating under horrific conditions, with dozens of malnourished and mistreated dogs rescued during the raid. Many had been rehomed, but some had never been accounted for. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Could the golden retriever have come from there? His thoughts raced as he tried to piece it all together. The kennel had been infamous for overbreeding and neglect, and if the dog had once been part of that operation, it would explain her wary yet loyal nature. It might even explain her strong maternal instincts. Jack leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he muttered softly, glancing at the dog. She stirred slightly, her tired eyes meeting his. Determined to confirm his suspicions, Jack reached for the phone and called the local animal control office. When a woman answered, Jack introduced himself and explained what he'd found. "I think I might have one of the dogs from that kennel case a few years back," he said. The line went silent for a moment before she responded. "That was a rough case," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "Most of the dogs were adopted out, but some went missing before we could rescue them all. If she's one of them, she's been through more than you know." After hanging up, Jack sat quietly for a long time, staring at the fire. He thought about how close she had come to losing everything on those tracks. Whatever horrors she'd endured, she had survived, for herself and for her puppies. Jack felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over him. It wasn't just about giving her a safe place to rest anymore. He needed to make sure she had the life she deserved, one that would finally allow her to heal. The next morning, Jack woke early, determined to dig deeper into the golden retriever's past. The winter sun cast a pale light over his small farmhouse as he brewed coffee and scribbled notes in his old notebook. The name of the kennel and the reports from years ago stuck in his mind. If this dog had indeed come from there, then there might still be someone in town who knew more about what happened after it shut down. Jack decided to pay a visit to the local library, hoping their archive of newspapers might hold the answers he was looking for. The library was quiet, its rows of books and files bathed in the soft glow of fluorescent lights. Jack greeted the librarian, Mrs. Whitaker, a kind woman in her 70s who had lived in the town her entire life. "Morning, Jack," she said with a smile. "What brings you here so early?" Jack explained his search, and her face grew serious. "That kennel," she said, shaking her head. "It was a tragedy. People around here still don't like to talk about it. But let me see what I can find for you." She disappeared into the back room and returned with a stack of old newspaper clippings. Jack sifted through the yellowed pages, his fingers tracing headlines like "Neglect Scandal Shakes Local Community" and "Dogs Rescued from Horrific Conditions." The articles described the grim reality of what investigators had found: overcrowded cages, malnourished dogs, and a history of violations ignored for years. One detail caught Jack's attention: a mention of certain dogs bred specifically for their loyalty and protective nature, traits prized by the kennel's former owners for sales to security companies. Jack's heart sank as he thought of the golden retriever. She wasn't just a survivor, she might have been bred for exploitation. One article in particular stood out. It described how several dogs had escaped before the authorities arrived, fleeing into the surrounding countryside. The article noted that local farmers had spotted strays in the months that followed, but no formal effort had been made to track them down. Jack's thoughts turned to the Miller farm. It made sense now. She had likely taken refuge there after escaping the kennel, doing everything she could to survive while protecting her puppies. But the story felt incomplete. Why had she ended up on the tracks? What had pushed her to leave the safety of the farm? As Jack closed the last of the files, Mrs. Whitaker approached with a small envelope in her hand. "I found this in the donation box last year," she said. "It's from one of the kennel's former employees. I didn't know what to do with it at the time, but maybe it'll help you." Jack opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter, its edges worn from age. The words were scrawled in a shaky hand. "I'm sorry for what happened to those dogs. If anyone ever finds them, please give them the kindness they were denied." Jack folded the letter and tucked it into his jacket pocket. His resolve solidified. He didn't know who had written it, but he knew what he had to do. Back at the farmhouse, Jack sat by the wood stove, staring at the letter Mrs. Whitaker had given him. The golden retriever lay on her blanket, her puppies sleeping soundly by her side. The handwritten apology from the kennel's former employee weighed on his mind. It spoke of guilt, of atrocities too painful to fully describe, but also of a glimmer of hope that someone might someday bring healing to the dogs who had endured so much. Jack looked at the golden retriever, her weary eyes still filled with quiet strength. He was determined to be that someone for her and her pups. The next step was clear. Jack needed to help her move forward, both physically and emotionally. He called Dr. Collins, the town's veterinarian, and explained the situation. "Sounds like she's been through hell," Dr. Collins said, his voice heavy with concern. "Bring her in tomorrow. We'll check her over, make sure she's healing properly, and get her and the pups the care they need." Jack hung up, feeling a small sense of relief. For the first time in days, it felt like progress. That night, as the fire crackled softly, Jack couldn't help but reflect on his growing connection to the golden retriever. She wasn't just a stray anymore. She was part of his life, her quiet resilience reminding him of his own struggles after losing his wife. He thought about how she had refused to abandon her pups on the tracks, even in the face of death. That kind of love and loyalty was rare, and it stirred something in Jack that he hadn't felt in years: a purpose. She had given him a reason to care again, and he silently vowed to repay her courage with the life she deserved. The next morning, Jack loaded the golden retriever and her puppies into his truck. The drive to Dr. Collins' clinic was calm. The puppies nestled together in a crate lined with blankets, while the mother dog sat quietly in the passenger seat. She watched the passing fields with an almost serene expression, as if sensing she was finally safe. When they arrived at the clinic, Dr. Collins greeted them warmly and examined each of the dogs. "She's stronger than I expected," he said, patting the mother dog gently. "But that leg will take time to heal. The pups are healthy, though, thanks to her care." As Jack loaded the dogs back into his truck, he felt a renewed sense of hope. Dr. Collins had given him a list of steps to ensure the dog's recovery, and Jack was ready to follow it to the letter. As he drove home, he glanced at the golden retriever, who had curled up on the seat beside him. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but there was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. For the first time, Jack felt like they were truly moving forward, not just toward recovery, but toward something better. The days that followed were filled with quiet determination. Jack dedicated himself to caring for the golden retriever and her puppies, following Dr. Collins' instructions meticulously. The mother dog, whom he had begun calling Maggie, was slowly regaining her strength. Her leg was healing well, though she still limped slightly when she walked. The puppies, now growing more curious and active, filled the once silent house with playful barks and squeals. For the first time in years, Jack's home felt alive. Each morning, Jack would sit on the porch with his coffee, Maggie resting by his feet while the puppies explored the yard. Maggie had become more comfortable with Jack's presence, leaning into his hand when he stroked her fur or lying beside him while he worked on small repairs around the property. But there were still moments when her eyes grew distant, as if she were remembering something painful. Jack never pushed her, allowing her to come to him on her own terms. Their bond was growing, built on quiet trust and patience. One afternoon, as Jack was chopping wood, he noticed Maggie watching him intently from the porch. She had begun to venture farther from the house but always stayed within sight. Jack smiled at her, wiping sweat from his brow. "You keeping an eye on me, girl?" he asked. Maggie tilted her head, her ears perking up at the sound of his voice. It was a small moment, but it reminded Jack how far they'd come from that night on the tracks. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by something gentler: acceptance. As the sun began to set, Jack carried the puppies inside while Maggie followed close behind. He had set up a small play area for them in the living room, complete with soft blankets and a few chew toys he'd picked up in town. Watching the puppies tumble over each other, Maggie finally relaxed completely, stretching out on the floor with a contented sigh. Jack sat beside her, gently rubbing her head. "You've done a good job, Maggie," he said quietly. "They're lucky to have you." Maggie nuzzled his hand, her gratitude clear. That night, Jack sat by the fire, Maggie lying at his feet as the puppies slept soundly nearby. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd lost: peace. Maggie had brought light back into his life, and in return, he had given her and her puppies the safety and love they had long been denied. But even as they settled into this newfound calm, Jack couldn't ignore the lingering questions about her past. There was still one final piece of the puzzle to uncover, and Jack knew he couldn't rest until he found it. A few weeks later, Jack found himself watching Maggie and her puppies thrive in a way he hadn't thought possible. The puppies, now stronger and more adventurous, bounded around the yard with endless energy, their little tails wagging furiously. Maggie, her leg almost fully healed, had started to run with them, her golden coat catching the light of the morning sun. Jack leaned against the porch railing, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, and felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Every morning, Jack would take Maggie and the puppies on short walks around the property, letting them explore the fields and trees. The bond between him and Maggie had grown into something unshakable. She followed him wherever he went, her trust in him now complete. Her eyes no longer held the haunted look they once had, replaced instead with a quiet contentment. For Jack, she had become more than just a dog. She was family. But even as they moved forward, Jack felt a lingering pull to uncover the full truth of Maggie's story. One afternoon, he returned to the library to show Mrs. Whitaker a photo of Maggie and her puppies. "She looks like she's doing well," the librarian said with a smile. Then, studying the picture more closely, she added, "I think I've seen a dog like her before." There was a photo in one of the articles about the kennel. She could be the same one. Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was confirmation that Maggie had likely been one of the escaped dogs, a survivor of something no animal should have to endure. Though the past couldn't be changed, Jack realized it no longer mattered as much. What truly mattered was the life Maggie and her puppies were living now. A life filled with care, safety, and love. Jack decided to keep the letter from the kennel's former employee as a reminder, not of Maggie's pain, but of her resilience. She had survived the unthinkable and found her way to him. Together, they had created something beautiful out of the broken pieces of her past. That evening, Jack sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Maggie lay beside him, her head resting on his foot, while the puppies curled up on a blanket nearby. Jack stroked her fur gently, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, he smiled. This wasn't just the end of Maggie's journey. It was the start of something new for both of them. Enjoyed Maggie's incredible story of survival and hope? Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this one.